I want to talk a little bit about how these responses operate within the child. What do they do? Because in addition to the emotional side, we respond to this developmentally. If you bring, I think I've already said this once, but I'm going to say it again. If you bring nothing from today, bring this. Children who've experienced significant traumatic experience can learn differently, can act differently, can relate differently, because their neurobiological development has been altered by that experience. They, in fact, are different. Not in a negative way, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? But in a way that says, this is not about a choice. I'm not making a bad decision. Well, I may be making a bad decision, but it's not like I'm saying, gee, let me make a really bad decision and be a pain in your neck today. It's not what's going on. The neurobiology gets altered. And it gets altered in a very straightforward way. Think about those of you that have kids. You know, you have that first child, and what does the pediatrician say in the first visit? Stimulate the child. Play beautiful music. Bright lights. Talk to the child. Even though they can't talk, talk. Stimulate those language centers. Help this child know and become verbal. Because as you stimulate parts of the brain, that's where all those gray brain cells go. That's where the connections get made. Now, if what I'm experiencing is trauma and I'm triggering my limbic system, which is that neuro piece that mediates that fight, flight, or freeze response, you're familiar with that? The tight stomach, like what do I do? Fight, flight, or freeze? That's limbic, that's the trauma response, neurophysiologically. And if you are triggering that, whether it's an actual event at the time, or if it's your recollection of an event, what are we reinforcing? The limbic system. And the limbic system is a very low-level brain system. In fact, every mammal has it. You see it in squirrels. They cross the street, cars come, and what does the squirrel do? Freeze, right? And then it demonstrates its complete lack of cerebral cortex, or thinking ability, because instead of taking 2 steps and being safe on the sidewalk, it turns around, which it's imprinted to do, and runs back in front of the car. It goes back from where it came from. And so it is this constant triggering of this limbic system that can create shifts in the neurobiological development of the child. And shifts in 3 areas. One is size of different brain regions. Size of the brain. And not every kid with significant experience will have these, but just pick one. Size. Left cerebral cortex. Anyone know what happens in the left cerebral cortex of the brain? What's centered there? It's the center for language. So you could have a child coming into school who, by bent of their experience, the traumatic experience, has less neurophysiological capability to acquire and utilize language, not just spoken, but nonverbal language as well, than the child sitting next to them. Also memory, particularly memory systems like the amygdala and the hippocampus, small areas in the brain. So it can alter size. It can also alter utilization. When we think about kids and ourselves, and I know for me, my last name is Ristuccia, so I tend to be a little reactive. I get that from my dad. And I always try to be mindful. I try to push my reactions up to become thoughtful, mindful, right? That occurs in those upper brain regions, the cerebral cortex, where we're mindful. And that's what we want our kids to do, isn't it? Particularly in school. You know, I know you felt that way. What other options did you have? That's a question implying I want you to be mindful. I want you to think about options. And then choose one of those others. That all happens up here. Reactive is happening down here. And kids with some of these alterations, they're not utilizing the upper levels. They're utilizing the lower level, the limbic system, the reactive part of the brain, not the thoughtful part of the brain. So they're, boom, they're reacting. Hey, we got a spelling test on Friday. I'm not doing no spelling test on Friday, right? Reactive. And then the last piece is hormone and transmitter secretion. Students with significant traumatic experience, when we trigger that trauma response, and by the way, those with significant experience, takes much less of a stimulus to trigger that response. It's triggered at very, very low levels, almost appropriate levels of stress induction. They will secrete hundreds of times more stress hormones into their bloodstream than students without traumatic experience. Serum cortisol is one of the primary stress hormones, and that'll get pumped in 200, 300, 400 times as much. So a student with significant traumatic experience, whether they're demonstrating it or not, walking around to school, right, getting triggered by things like, don't forget we have a test Friday, and someone bumping them in the hall or someone giving them a look they didn't quite know how to interpret, is a floating vessel of stress hormones, right? So, the experience can alter the neurobiology, not only in size and utilization, but also hormone transmitter secretion. Having said all that, and having also talked a little bit about how, not universal, but how common these experiences are, there are a lot of people who are very resilient in spite of this, right? They do well. They get through it. They become successful. So what is it that allows that to happen? What are the main influencing factors that can mitigate or exacerbate that traumatic response to an event? And the first is the individual characteristics. Developmental stage, age, intellectual ability, history, sort of the individual. And that is what that is. The second is the environment. I want to pause here because of the three items we're going to talk about, and the third one is the event characteristics, the frequency and intensity. Can't really control that. The individual, developmentally, it's where they're at. Place where we do have some influences in the environment. Context. The environment within which the student operates, within which the student moves and can have a significant impact on that child's response to potentially traumatic events. And that's something, particularly within a school, that we can begin to influence what that context is and what it looks like.